For this week, we're going to have an overview of Chapter 6, the bone tissue and the skeletal system. In this video, I'm going to provide details on those portions of the chapter that are more difficult. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at these sections. Section 6.3 on bone structure, Section 6.4 on bone formation and development, and lastly, Section 6.7 on calcium homeostasis. By the end of this section, you'll be able to identify the anatomical features of a bone, describe the histology of bone tissue, compare and contrast compact and spongy bone tissue, and lastly, identify the structures that compose compact and spongy bone tissue. So let's first take a look at a bone. So if we look at a long bone like the humerus or the femur, we would see some distinct features. Long bones have two epiphyses. The singular form of that word is epiphysis, and they have a diaphysis. As you can see from this diagram, there's a proximal epiphysis, a distal epiphysis, and a diaphysis. If you learn some root words, that will help. EPI, epa, means on top of, and the root word dia means through. You'll notice that there's a typographical error in this diagram. It should be D-I-A, P-H-Y-S-I-S. Dia means through, like diameter. Like the diameter of a circle is the distance through that circle. So let's look at the diaphysis first. The diaphysis has within it a hollow section called the medullary cavity. And within that cavity, there is something called yellow bone marrow. This yellow bone marrow is a fatty substance. The compact bone is found along the edges, as you can see here, of the diaphysis. And we'll take a look at spongy bone and compact bone in more detail in a later section. Let's now look at the epiphyses. In the epiphyses, we have what is called spongy bone, and in between this spongy bone tissue is a jelly-like substance called red bone marrow. This is the place where blood is made, the red blood cells, the white blood cells, and the platelets. On the ends of the bones, you'll see something called articular cartilage. The word articular refers to joints, and articulation is a joint. At the juncture between the epiphyses and the diaphysis is an area called the metaphysis. You can see it here. An interesting structure is found at the location of the metaphysis. If a child hasn't reached adulthood yet, then there will be what is called an epiphyseal plate at this location. What it is a band of cartilage. On the other hand, if they have reached adulthood and they are no longer growing, there will be a structure called the epiphyseal line. Here in this X-ray, we can see an epiphyseal plate at the two ends of this particular bone. Let's now take a look at some of the other areas of the bone. There's a layer of cells referred to as the endosteum, and this is a layer of cells that lines the medullary cavity. The periosteum, on the other hand, is a membrane that's found on the outside of the bone. You can easily remember this by just remembering what the root word P-E-R-I means. It means around, like perimeter. The perimeter of a circle is the distance around the circle. This periosteum, as you can see, contains blood vessels. It also has nerves and lymphatic tissue. The tendons and the ligaments also attach to the periosteum. In other words, the tendons and ligaments sort of weave themselves into the periosteum so that they can be attached to the bone. Let's now take a look at bone cells and tissue. Bone tissue, or otherwise known as osseous tissue, is a type of connective tissue. And if you remember correctly, connective tissue is characterized by having an extracellular matrix with cells that are far apart from each other. The bone's extracellular matrix is 15% water, 30% collagen fibers, and about 55% crystallized mineral salts. The collagen fibers allow the bone to be somewhat flexible. If you were to take something like a chicken bone, dissolve it in hydrochloric acid, that is, get rid of the mineral salts, what you would find is that it would be flexible. You could sit there and bend it like that and it wouldn't break. The most abundant mineral in the bone is calcium phosphate. Let's now take a look at the different kinds of cells that are found in bone tissue. We'll start with what are called osteogenic cells. These are stem cells, which means that they are unspecialized. But when they divide, they'll divide to become osteoblasts. These osteogenic cells are found along the inner portion of the periosteum, and also in the endosteum, and also in the canals of bones that contain blood vessels. Let's now take a look at osteoblast. The root word blast refers to the fact that these are cells that are in an immature state. They are bone building cells. They're not mature yet. What they're doing is they're secreting collagen fibers and other kinds of chemicals in order to form the extracellular matrix. So in other words, they're depositing this material that's going to become the extracellular matrix. And they're depositing it around themselves. Once they have completely surrounded themselves with these secretions, they are then now called osteocytes. Let's now take a look at osteocytes. The root word cyte means cell, and this is a very important root word that I think you should always remember. So, in other words, osteocytes are mature bone cells. They're completely surrounded by the extracellular matrix. And they're carrying out just the everyday metabolism of bone tissue. That is, they're taking on oxygen, they're giving off CO2, they're doing the same kinds of things that all cells of the body perform. And these are located in the interior of bone, and we'll see specifically where they are located in just a few minutes. The next type of cell are referred to as the osteoclasts. The root word class means to break, which will make more sense in a few minutes. These are concentrated in the endosteum, as you can see here in this diagram. And these cells are made from the fusion of monocytes. Monocytes are a type of white blood cell. These osteoclasts have what is called a ruffled border that you can see here in this diagram. And these cells secrete digestive enzymes and acids that are used for dissolving bone. This process of breaking down bone, that is dissolving it, using these digestive enzymes, is called resorption. And this is actually a normal process found in bone tissue. It's part of the process of remodeling. Remodeling is the process of taking old bone, dissolving it, and also the process of establishing a new bone by using the osteoblasts. So these osteoclasts are used for taking bone that is old and degenerating it. These osteoclasts are also used in regulating the levels of calcium in your blood, and we'll see how they do that in just a few minutes. Let's now take a look at compact bone and spongy bone. Compact bone is found under the periosteum and also is found in the diaphysis, and it provides protection and support for the bone. You can see a diagram of it here from your textbook, and let's take a look at this diagram in more detail. This might be a little bit confusing, so let's see if we can understand this. If you look down the length of the diaphysis, what you would find is these osteons that are running the length of the diaphysis. So here's an osteon, and as you can see, it consists of a number of parts, some things called concentric lamellae, and an area called the central canal, which contains blood vessels, nerves, and lymphatic vessel. So let's take a look at this under the light microscope. If you were to cut the diaphysis with a transverse section and then look at the top of it, this is what you would see. As you can see here, this is an osteon, And what it has is a central canal, and that's where blood vessels and nerves and lymphatic tissue is located. And each of these little dark structures is referred to as a lacuna. And that's where the osteocytes are located. You would find an osteocyte in each one of these lacunae, plural, lacuna, singular. Again, here's the osteon, otherwise known as a Haversian system. Here's the central canal. Again, that's where blood vessels, nerves, and lymphatic vessels are located. And each one of those little dark lines is a lacuna, lacunae, plural, put an E on the end to make it plural. And again, that's where the osteocytes are located. Here's another picture looking at an osteon. We have an osteon here. Here's a central canal. This looks like a lacuna here. Looks like one here, one here. All these little extensions are called canaliculi, and that's the way that oxygen gets to the cells. Oxygen would leave the artery that's in here, and then the oxygen would diffuse through the canaliculi and then eventually get to the lacuna where the osteocyte is located. Let's now take a look at spongy bone. As we saw earlier, spongy bone is found in the epiphyses of long bones. This isn't the only place where it's located. It's found in a variety of bones inside of the skeletal system, but it's easier to see in this picture of the long bone. The spongy bone doesn't contain osteons, and as we can see, the spongy bone is located in the interior of bone. And it consists of columns referred to as trabeculae. These aren't very clearly illustrated in this picture, but where you can see them a lot better here. They are these little plate-like, kind of rod-like structures that make up the spongy bone. Let's now take a look at bone formation and development. This is talking about how bone forms while an embryo and fetus are developing. There's two types of ossification, the process of bone development. These two types are called intramembranous ossification and endochondral ossification. Intramembranous ossification is a type of ossification in which bone develops directly within the sheets of what's called mesenchymal connective tissue. Mesenchyme is an embryonic connective tissue from which all other connective tissues arise. And the type of bones that develop through this intramembranous ossification are the flat bones of the face, most cranial bones, and the clavicles. Endochondral ossification, on the other hand, involves bone replacing hyaline cartilage, and you can tell this from the root word. Endo means within, and chondro means cartilage. The types of bones that are formed this way are bones at the base of the skull and also the long bones. Let's now look at our last topic, and that's the topic of calcium homeostasis. Before we talk about how the level of calcium ions in the bloodstream are regulated, what we're going to look at first is why it's so important to have the proper level of calcium ions in the blood. Of course, calcium is needed for bone development, but it's also needed for heart contractions. In other words, in order for the heart to contract, calcium has to go into the heart and cause the contractions. It's also important for smooth and skeletal muscle contraction. And it's also needed for blood clotting, and it's also involved in the conduction of nerve impulses. In order to understand the role of the bone in regulating the calcium ion level in the bloodstream, you have to remember that the skeleton acts as a calcium reservoir. Well, what do we mean by that? Well, a reservoir is a place where things are stored when you have plenty of them. For instance, a water reservoir would store plenty of water during the rainy season. But during the dry season, when there's not much water in the environment, then we would draw upon that reservoir and use it for watering crops and so forth. Well, the skeleton is kind of the same way. It's a storage place for calcium. And whenever we have plenty of calcium in our bloodstream, then we can store it in the skeleton. On the other hand, when we're low on calcium in the bloodstream, then we can release that calcium from the bone and put it into the blood. So this is the whole idea of the skeleton acting as a reservoir of calcium ions. Again, the idea is that if we have a low level of calcium ions in our bloodstream, then the bone can release the calcium from the bone tissue and put it out into the blood. It's hormones that regulate the level of calcium ions in the blood. The first hormone we're going to take a look at is the parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone raises the level of calcium ions in the blood. So, in other words, if the level of calcium ions were too low, then through a process of negative feedback, the parathyroid hormone will raise the level of calcium ion back to the normal levels. A hormone that does the opposite is called calcitonin. This is a hormone that is released from certain cells of the thyroid gland, and its role is to lower the calcium ion levels if it's too high. So in other words, if the calcium ion levels are too high, what will happen is the calcitonin will be released by the thyroid gland, and that will bring the calcium ion levels back down to the normal homeostatic levels. So let's go back to the parathyroid hormone. Here you can see it is a hormone that is secreted by the parathyroid glands. The parathyroid glands are 4 little dots that are found on the posterior side of the thyroid gland. At least for most people, they have 4. Some people have more than that. So now let's take a look at this parathyroid hormone in more detail. The secretion of it is regulated by negative feedback. In other words, whenever there's low levels of calcium ions in the blood, the parathyroid glands will detect that, and in response, they will start secreting parathyroid hormone. What that does then is it raises the calcium ion levels back up to homeostatic levels. But how does the parathyroid hormone accomplish that? How does it get the levels of calcium ions back up to normal levels? Well, it does that in 3 different ways. One way is that it increases the number and activity of the osteoclasts. You'll remember that the osteoclasts are the cells that dissolve bone tissue. They have that ruffled border that secretes digestive enzymes and acids, and when they dissolve the bone tissue, that releases calcium ions into the bloodstream. Another way that parathyroid hormone works is by working on the kidneys and decreasing the loss of calcium out of the blood and into the urine. So let me see if I can explain that in more detail. The role of the kidneys is to filter the blood. That is to take what's in the blood and determine what needs to be taken out of the blood and put into the urine and what needs to stay in the blood. So what this parathyroid hormone does is it acts on the kidneys and tells the kidneys, as you are filtering the blood, don't remove very much or any calcium out of the blood, and don't take it out of that blood and put it into the urine. Keep it in the blood. That will help keep those calcium ion level concentrations up where they need to be. And the third way that the parathyroid hormone works is by stimulating the formation of a hormone called calcitriol. This is the active form of vitamin D. The role of vitamin D is to allow for the absorption of calcium out of our food at the site of the small intestine. So if you stop and think about what needs to be accomplished, it kind of makes sense that the parathyroid hormone would work in these three ways. Is we're eating food, we're going to absorb more of it into the blood, and as the blood is being filtered, the kidneys are going to retain the calcium ions and not excrete them into the urine. And thirdly, the hormone tells the skeleton dissolve away some of this tissue and allow the calcium to go into the bloodstream. Let's now take a look at calcitonin. This is a hormone that does just the opposite. It is secreted by certain cells of the thyroid gland. Not all cells. There's other hormones that are secreted by the thyroid gland, but only certain cells secrete this hormone. And its role is to take the calcium ion level in the blood and bring it down. Here's a picture that you can see of a dissection that shows you the thyroid gland. You can see the border of it here, and it has a little section here that's a little bit smaller. This is called the isthmus. Here's one of the lobes, and here's the other lobe. So calcitonin, again, it's secreted by certain cells of the thyroid gland, and as was the case with parathyroid hormone, its secretion is regulated by negative feedback. In other words, if the level of calcium ions in the blood is too high, the thyroid gland will detect that and will secrete calcitonin in response. Calcitonin then brings the level of calcium ion levels back down to homeostatic levels. And the way that it does this is by inhibiting the activity of osteoclasts. In other words, tells the osteoclasts, don't break down tissue, don't break down the skeleton and raise it. Rather, just back off and don't put calcium ions into the bloodstream. So here's a picture out of your textbook that takes a look at both of those hormones. Let's suppose we're in a state of calcium ion homeostasis, but let's say for whatever reason your calcium ion levels go up, and if that happens, then the thyroid gland secretes calcitonin. It goes to the bone tissue and inhibits the activity of osteoclasts. It also tells the kidneys to decrease their reabsorption of calcium ions, and this brings the calcium ion levels back down. If the level goes too low, then we have the parathyroid glands releasing parathyroid hormone that acts on the osteoclasts, increase their activity. Also tells the kidneys to reabsorb as much of the calcium as it can out of the blood. Don't put it into the urine. And lastly, parathyroid hormone activates vitamin D and tells the allows the vitamin D to be used at the site of the small intestine so that the calcium is absorbed. So that ends Chapter 6. If you have any questions, feel free to email me.